Welcome, everyone, to the ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the planning committee for these programs. We're based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday sessions. Our program today is on the emerging contradictions and issues and current situation in the international communist movement. Our speaker, Christopher Helali, is the International Secretary of the American Communist Party, ACP, and North American Chair of the DPRK International Solidarity Group. He is an educator, independent investigative journalist, researcher, and geopolitical analyst. We're going to start off with a presentation by Chris, short break for announcements, and then we'll have questions and answers from audience members. So welcome, Chris, to the Sunday Morning Marxist Forum.
Thank you very much to everyone for having me. It's a great honor and privilege to be with you all. As was mentioned, I'm the International Secretary for the American Communist Party, and my responsibility is, as I'm sure you all are well aware, is to be a sort of a diplomat and to meet with other parties, to meet with other governments, to meet with other international organizations, and to continue to build the internationalism and the solidarity and the fraternity we have with other countries, with other peoples, and with other movements around the world. Of course, right now, we're in a period of tremendous contradictions, antagonisms, and division within the international communist movement. These have been really, I think, highlighted and deepened by a few key areas that many of the parties, especially in many of the international organizations, and especially within Solidnet, have disputes over. The first one that I think is critical to understand is the situation in China, the question of whether China is socialist. And this has been a very deep conversation. It has been a very fractured debate. And of course, there are not only international, but regional and national considerations, depending on the Communist Party that's interpreting what China is and how it relates to their country and their region. In this instance, of course, it would be important to highlight that for the international meeting of communist and workers' parties, Solidnet, the Communist Party of Greece has an important role to play. And the Communist Party of Greece, the KKE, has a few key disagreements and challenges to the notion that, for example, China is a socialist country. Of course, one of the most prescient and close to home for the Greeks is the fact that China now controls the major port in Piraeus, which has been something that has really brought about antagonisms between the Greek and Chinese relationship in terms of their communist parties. So this issue has, of course, deepened, and this contradiction has made it difficult for some parties to see eye to eye on this situation. The second major issue within Solidnet is Russia. Not necessarily a question of Russia's economy. I think everybody agrees on where Russia is economically speaking. But the question of whether Russia plays a progressive or reactionary role in terms of the defense of the people in the Donbass, in Crimea, the ongoing special military operation, and also whether the nature of Russia in the capitalist world economy. These issues, coupled with a few others that we can certainly get into, are, I think, at the forefront. They are the crux of what we are here to speak about today. The the situation, of course, is a complex one, and different parties arrive at their theoretical insights using the same text, but with different interpretations to those texts. And I think that this says something about how different groups of people might read the same thing, but might come to different conclusions. For example, everyone has read Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, but different parties have come to different conclusions about what Lenin means by imperialism, what Lenin means when he's speaking about who's an imperialist and who's not. Of course, I think that it's important to identify the five main economic traits of imperialism that Lenin outlines in his text. The first, of course, is the concentration of production and capital, where they reach a high level that give rise to monopolies, the monopolization forces, and that plays the critical and decisive role in the economic life, especially within the imperial core. The second is the fusion of banking and industrial capital, which gives rise to finance capital and financial oligarchy, which was a key aspect of what Lenin was speaking about. The next one is, of course, the pivotal one that we are probably going to focus on, which is the export of capital, unlike the export of goods, which acquires a heightened importance for Lenin. The fourth is the international monopoly groups are formed that divide the world among themselves, that really focus on many of these, how to carve up the world. We remember many of these old drawings and artwork from the time period where, for example, China is a pie and they're cutting off pieces for different areas of control. The fifth is it culminates the process of territorial distribution of the world among capitalist powers. So basically, they divide the world amongst themselves. I think here it's important to recognize that the theory that emerges within the international communist movement from the side of the Communist Party of Greece is a focus on the third element that I mentioned, which was the export of capital. That if a country is exporting capital rather than exporting goods, it is more important to recognize that country as being at least part of the imperialist system, and therefore an imperialist power of their own. And of course, the theory that emerges is modeled after an illustration which the former General Secretary of the Communist Party of Greece, Aleka Paparika, denoted in her famous text, which was the pyramid. That basically you have top imperial powers, and she identifies the United States, Russia, and China in those top imperialist powers. And then below that, you have other imperialist powers. Basically, you have greater imperialist powers and lesser imperialist powers. And basically, all of it rests on the fact that the idea that these countries are exporting capital involved with their national bourgeoisies in the capitalist world economy indicates, without a doubt, for the Communist Party of Greece that they are, in fact, capitalist and imperialist. So what is fascinating, of course, in that perspective, is that there's no country in that theoretical schema that is not imperialist. Every country would therefore be imperialist. And of course, that has been the criticism of the Communist Party of Greece, is even countries like Cuba and the DPRK would be considered minor imperialist powers. And this, of course, creates tremendous issues, tremendous contradictions within the understanding. That, for example, simply by exporting capital, by having a national bourgeoisie involved in financial markets and instruments of capital on a world economic scale, therefore, they are in some way involved and enmeshed within the imperialist hierarchy. Of course, the pyramid structure is clear that there are major imperialist powers, but the fact that you are below does not make you any less imperialist, I guess. It's just a matter of degree, a matter of power in that framework. So with that understanding, I think it's very pivotal for us to recognize that this has created a situation where we need to come back to the basics, that parties are speaking in ways that they cannot find common ground. They might find common ground on a lot of the overarching language, but the theoretical application of this language becomes disjointed and uneven, and even leads to antagonisms, which we have seen. I think that here we can realize that some of the issues that have emerged within Solidnet around certain countries and certain perspectives is rooted fundamentally in the interpretation of this pivotal concept of who's imperialist and who isn't imperialist, who's at the core and who's at the periphery. What is the relationship between them? Is it a singular imperialist bloc, or are there inter-imperialist powers that are vying for control of the world and dividing it amongst themselves? This, of course, is very, very, I think, complicated territory, and of course, at the very heart of where we see the fractures. The second part, of course, that we can speak about is Russia, because, of course, many of the parties in the international communist movement, of course, had many of their leaders and cadre who studied in the Soviet Union, who supported the Soviet Union to greater or lesser extents throughout the history of the USSR's existence. And therefore, the liquidation of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the transformations therein have led to varying perspectives about what Russia is and where Russia is headed. So, of course, this, of course, I think cuts the other way on the question of patriotism and sort of a sort of a national identity, which I think has become problematic for some parties more so than others. And so, for example, various parties will level claims of national chauvinism or reactionary ideology to various parties which look back into their history and try to create a sort of harmony of a continuous national identity. And of course, these claims are leveled especially at the KPRF, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, by other parties. Now we'd like to, of course, address in this situation, which I'm sure there might be some questions about what happened before and, of course, especially after 2014 and how this has led to the divisions. I think 2014 as a really axial moment had most communist parties in support to a greater or lesser extent of the Ukrainian people against the Western-backed junta that was imposed on them. The response to that led to much more divisions. So the vote for Crimea to become independent and then to eventually move into the Russian Federation as an oblast, and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics that emerged and fought back against the perceived threat of Nazism and ultra-right and so on. This, of course, led to varying levels of support. And of course, we can fast forward to 2022, where the moment of the special military operation divided the entire international communist movement. And of course, I think this is apparent with what happened in Izmir and what happened in Havana, where parties were creating especially competing resolutions. And those resolutions really defined the blocs that were supportive of Russia in the special military operation and those opposed to Russia. And the interpretation that either this was an anti-fascist war, a continuation of the Great Patriotic War, or this was an inter-imperialist war, and both sides are to blame for the situation. So I lay that out there We can go into more detail if you'd like, but time is of the essence here. So I'll move to another key part, and I see that we have some comrades who are involved in the ongoing situation. But for example, there are certain domestic situations which have brought about a level of contradiction that we didn't foresee. For example, in Venezuela, we have a popular Bolivarian government, and we have, of course, the Bolivarian Revolution that begins with Hugo Chavez and continues on with Nicolas Maduro. In that process, the Communist Party in Venezuela had played a pivotal role in the early part of the Bolivarian Revolution and was really active in the coalition with Hugo Chavez and in the early years of Nicolas Maduro. About a few years ago, the Communist Party of Venezuela changed its position and began advocating that Nicolas Maduro and you could say the PSUV leadership were a oppressive bourgeoisie, and that they were no longer carrying out the revolutionary goals that they had believed were started by Hugo Chavez, that there was a discontinuity now, and that there was a corruption and economic issues, and therefore the Communist Party of Venezuela joined the opposition to President Nicolas Maduro. This division, and then the division within Venezuela between, now we have two communist parties of Venezuela saying that they are the legitimate party, one supporting the government and one opposing the government, has created divisions within the international communist movement as well. Now, of course, we arrive at, I think, one of the most hot button topics, and I think it's very prescient given the fact that when we decided to do this webinar, we didn't know the full extent of what was happening in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, and of course, it's escalated a lot since we put this program together. And of course, the issue is that of Palestine. And when we think of Palestine and when we think of the international communist position, the question of Palestine and the solution to the question of Palestine is very divisive. For example, the international communist movement, and especially Solidnet, has as one of its participants, it has the Communist Party of Israel, right? So the Communist Party of Israel is a member of Solidnet. There are other parties within Solidnet that are, I would say, not antagonistic to the comrades in the Communist Party of Israel, but antagonistic to the existence of the State of Israel to begin with, and the interpretation of the history of that existence. In that vein, this also explains some of the divisions within CPUSA in those pivotal years in the mid-40s to the mid-50s about how to interpret Zionism as a political ideology. We remember the periodicals Jewish Affairs, and many of the former comrades in CPUSA who eventually were divided over the situation, and some left CPUSA and became ardent Zionists. So the question now is two-state, one-state, confederation, binational. What are we looking at? Ultimately, of course, we know that the Palestinian People's Party and the Palestinian Communist Party uphold the idea of a Palestinian state pre-1967 within the UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. However, there are some parties, and of course we can look to the region to look at these parties, who are more antagonistic to the existence of Israel, and also their countries are in a state of war with Israel now. When we think of Lebanon and Syria in this particular instance. So I think that it's important to understand that the interpretation of October 7th and after has also led to some divisions, with some communist parties having some level of support for the resistance, and other parties not having that same level of support for the resistance. And what we are seeing here, I think, is really another instance where the communist movement is not united in its perspectives on not only the material facts on the ground. I think more than not, they are united on the apartheid and occupation. But in terms of who plays a progressive role and who doesn't, how this ongoing, I would say, the ongoing atrocities, how the ongoing apartheid nature of the state can be resolved. And so I think that here we have another situation where the international communist movement remains united, but with internal divisions. So with all of these three things, especially Russia, China, Palestine, we could get into Syria, we could get into other places where there have been divisions as well. Venezuela, we spoke about. I think that we can see that this level of fracturing has created possibilities for maybe alternatives to Solidnet. And so here I'd like to speak about, and I know that you all have met with Jody Brar before, and she spoke on the imperialist pyramid as well, I think in the fall. And so Jody and I and our parties are members of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, which has basically taken strong positions on the question of Russia, China, and Palestine. And that makes it somewhat more unified on these issues, and makes a sharp division between communist parties on the other side, who might have different perspectives on one or more of these key issues. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform at this point doesn't seek to be a new Solidnet, but its goal is to be a union of parties and organizations around common principles that can fight also an ideological battle in support of these principles. And so we have seen a lot of theoretical texts back and forth between the platform and some Solidnet parties about some of these issues. At this point, of course, there is a little common ground on especially Russia and to a degree China. But I think that hopefully through struggle and through real investigation, other communist parties will hopefully arrive at a position that is correct on these situations. Lastly, of course, I would like to speak about multipolarity and the international order that we live in. Of course, the terms that are used can be used by different people, different political parties, different tendencies, different philosophies to mean varying things. But multipolarity here, as I use it, is a term of art in international relations and political science. Basically, unipolarity is one major power, one source of authority within a system, as opposed to an anarchic global order where there is no real major player on the international stage. There's also the bipolarity, sort of the what is commonly used in relation to the Cold War, where you had two major blocs that had that power, and of course, to a lesser extent, the non-aligned movement, which tried to emerge separately from that bloc, but ultimately, more often than not, sided with the Eastern Bloc or the Communist and Socialist Bloc, as opposed to the Western Bloc. And then, of course, you have multipolarity, and multipolarity simply emphasizes the fact that there are numerous centers of power in the global system, and these powers have regional considerations. And ultimately, the interplay of international relations is mediated through these great powers, either bilaterally, multilaterally, or through, obviously, international institutions like the United Nations. So the development of a multipolar world, the development of various international organizations or regional organizations of cooperation and development. For example, we can think of BRICS, we can think of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we can think of initiatives like the Belt and Road in China and others. And also we can think of the alternative, the opposite, which are, for example, Organization of American States, which the US has, and regional things like ECOWAS in the Sahel. These various institutions, organizations, and political entities, we could say, or even political structures that try to bring disparate groups together, what they ultimately do is they create a situation where no one power has full spectrum dominance, internationally speaking. There is a level of balance. And of course, for those who are scholars and readers of especially modern European history, we remember, for example, the various treaties after the major wars. We can start with Westphalia and go through Vienna and think about the importance of balance of powers. We can think about the importance of a stable international order that does not promote war and doesn't create antagonisms. Of course, antagonisms are inherent to the system, which is why I would argue that multipolarity is not the goal for many of the communist parties, and at least not for our party, and no party in the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, and I think in Solidnet would agree that multipolarity is not the end result, but it is a progressive move. And the argument that I would make and submit to you all is that multipolarity eventually would mean a decrease in power of the hegemonic system that we live in now, which is really could be described as unipolar, where the United States has over 1,000 military bases and secret black sites, where it has numerous active conflicts, where its military is engaged all over the world, where it promotes through regional and international security partnerships, including, of course, most notably NATO. Its own national security is imposed on other parts of the world, and its will seeks to dominate countries that do not agree with them, and the use of sanctions and blockades and covert operations and propaganda. A multipolar world would lessen those effects on many parts of the world. It would eventually mean that there would be regional areas that would not have as much influence or domination from the West. And I think that my interpretation and my theoretical insight is that this would create the necessary space for socialist and communist movements to flourish, for a labor movement to flourish, and ultimately for popular mass mobilizations of peoples to eventually take more power for themselves and to hopefully usher in new international a new international situation and new international structures that could bring countries closer together without sort of the yoke of the West on top of them. I think that that's what we're seeing in the Sahel with Burkina Faso, with Mali, with Niger. I think that that's what we're seeing with a lot of the so-called anti-imperialist countries, the countries that are in resistance, and even the countries that are maybe social democratic, but are definitely pivoting. And here I can think of even Mexico, are pivoting in a way that say, yes, we want to be good neighbors. We have a common history in certain instances, but we also want to pursue a path that is somewhat independent and in a way not totally aligned with some of the regional powers, but that allows for some diversity of opinion and foreign policy, especially. So in all of these instances, I think that multipolarity is something that is a necessary and objective development. It's not necessarily whether I like it or not, or whether you like it or not. The world system constantly transforms. Just like we had a Pax Romana, a Pax Britannica, a Pax Mongolica, we had passed through eras where empires were so vast that they controlled whole swaths of peoples and networks. That time of the US's dominance, I think, is slowly coming to an end. Whether it comes quickly or it will take more time, I'm not sure. But ultimately, the forces of production, the transformations in the international system, the struggles of people around the world is changing the balance of powers, and ultimately, I think will reshape the international order. And so with this, I submit to you that the international communist movement has a lot of important questions to deal with. And I think that we are in a even much more complex time than the time of Marx, Engels, Lenin, for sure. We have to deal with not only these international situations, but also with the development of new technologies, artificial intelligence, the rampant spread of information, statistics, currencies, markets. I mean, we are living in such a connected, globally connected world that I think that we have a lot of things to consider about where we go as an international communist movement and how we see other countries that are either rising or confronting or in full out, antagonistic relations with the West, and how we interpret and how we see them, I think will shape the future. I, of course, would love to leave a lot of time for discussion. There are a lot of people on here, some of whom I know, that I'm sure we could have a robust exchange. So I would like to open it up and we can discuss these topics together.
Okay, thank you. After a few short announcements, we're going to have questions and answers and comments from participants. To ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button at the lower part of your Zoom window. Today, what we're going to ask people to do is keep your questions short. We're going to do one question at a time, or maybe two that are closely related to each other, to give everyone a chance to participate. And keep in mind that this is a comradely forum for political discussion, so please show respect to other participants, the speaker, and the moderator of today's sessions. Before we start the Q&A, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. We have some really excellent programs coming up in the next few weeks. Next Sunday on October 20th, again at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, we're going to have Professor Grover Furr speaking on his latest book, Trotsky's Comintern Conspiracy, The Case of Osip Pianitsky. And this is a book that Professor Furr has just completed. He is one of our long-term most popular speakers that we've had on our Sunday morning sessions. So I want to urge everybody to come in and hear what he has to say, participate. Then on Sunday, October 27th, again at 10:30 Pacific time, we're going to have Charlotte Cates, who's the international coordinator of the Samandun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Movement, speaking on the increasing repression and resistance of the Palestinian Liberation Solidarity Movement. I want to call your attention to something. Charlotte was arrested by the Vancouver Police Department when she was on the bus home, riding the bus home after attending the establishment of a Palestinian solidarity encampment at the University of British Columbia. And she was charged with, quote, public incitement of hatred and, quote, willful promotion of hatred. After 2 hours of questioning, she was released with the condition that she not attend any protests, demonstrations, and assemblies. But Charlotte has continued speaking out and organizing, and there are now current efforts underway to have her rearrested and imprisoned again. So we want to have you come by and hear what she has to say and support her in her struggle. You can sign up for email notifications for our programs at ICSSmarks.org, where you can find a link. You can find links to past programs, video programs, video recordings of our past programs, and you can contact us with feedback, suggestions for future programs and topics, and to make a donation to support our Sunday morning program. Okay, so with that, what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to uh, questions and answers from the audience. And we have some hands raised. And again, if you want to raise your hand, go down to the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and raise your hand. We'll call on you. We'll try to get everybody in. And I'm going to start off with Roger Harris. So Roger, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Alan. And hi, Chris. It's good to see you. And thank you for a really excellent presentation. And then we celebrate the development of our anti-imperialist pole within the left. I think it's critical. And as you mentioned, 2014 was really a pivotal year. I want to ask you how you see some of the tasks for the left and for the communist movement, and particularly the question of unity. And I think if I understood your presentation, there was the system on Ukraine was really pivotal, and probably a a gap that can't be papered over. But I want to see what your views were on that. China maybe not so much. You posed the question of whether China is socialist or not, but perhaps another way of looking at it is what is the role that China plays in the anti-imperialist struggle, rather than whether it meets the Lenin litmus of the five criteria. So maybe you could talk about the potential for unity or of some sort of practical unity on China. And finally, the really contentious issue of Palestine. How is that one where the needs for unity is so overwhelming? How to create unity there? And then the flip side of that question, Chris, is at this point in the struggle, do you see the importance? Do you prioritize unity, or do you prioritize creating clear lines of distinction? I come out of the Maoist movement. We were very much in favor of clear lines of distinction. But now I'm wondering what in these, that was different times. And now I'm wondering what you consider the priorities for the communist movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger, and it's great to see you, really. Um, I'll go with the last one first, because I think it stresses all the other ones. I think it'll pave the road for the rest. I personally stress unity, and I think that unity is critical on these main issues. And I also see that because right now the communist movement is fractured in many countries, that there have been so many divisions around questions we haven't even addressed here, questions around identity, questions around the relationship between people and their nations and how they identify with those nations, with each other, personally. There's so many things that we can discuss outside of that. But in terms of what we're speaking about here, in terms of unity, that's why I think the World Anti-Imperialist Platform is so important, because it has united different tendencies around a clear program. That is, anti-imperialism is the most important aspect of our struggle today. And so therefore, when you spoke about the Lenin's litmus test in terms of whether it's socialist or not, or whatever sort of a formula or equation we want to use, I would argue, and I would submit to you all, that those things are secondary to the important task of defeating what I believe to be the US, EU, NATO imperialist axis. That right now, the world's oppressed, the nations which are suffering the most, and some we didn't even address here. I think of the sanctions on Zimbabwe, the sanctions on the DPRK. There's over 30 countries sanctioned, some to a greater or lesser extent, but all of them within the crosshairs of the United States and their allies. There are so many places in the world where people are struggling, and I think that it's a disservice for the international communist movement to be with its finger up and say, but you are not pure enough. You are not good enough in this way, and therefore we won't support you in this regard, and we're going to criticize you. I think there's a space for criticism always, but I think it needs to be tactfully done. It needs to be done internally. It needs to be done in a way that allows for dialogue behind the scenes. But if we air out all of our grievances in public, the enemy, of course, uses that to their advantage and divides the movement even more and pins groups against each other. For example, you and I are involved with, for example, in Latin America. When I was in Nicaragua in January, and I went to visit on a delegation, and on a delegation of one, it was just me. I went to visit and wanted to really build the bridges for the communist movement. And the Nicaraguans said, you know, everybody always talks about Cuba and Venezuela, but they forget us. We're also revolutionary. We're also here. We're also struggling in a way. And so, of course, I emphasize in all of my texts to include all three, right? That's why John Bolton used the terminology troika of tyranny, right? But I think that sometimes we forget some of these other countries that may not fit the formula perfectly, that have their own development, that had their own revolutionary tradition with their own, I think, characteristics that might not be as appealing to some who like the imagery of old and like these kinds of things. So I think that ultimately, when we look at the tasks for unity, I think that anti-imperialism should be the main criteria. And with that understanding, therefore, you are correct in your assessment when you think of the question of China, whether it's socialist or not, is secondary to the fact of whether it plays a progressive role in the international world system, right? Of whether it plays a progressive role in relation to countries that are opposing the current imperialist system. And so I would agree. I would agree. I think that that is the correct view. And I think that that's the view of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, that yes, it's good to sit down. And for those who don't know, I got my master's in Marxism in China. I lived in China for 2 years. I studied there. And I had a wonderful time from 2013 to 2015 in China. And I think that there is a lot of time that can be spent looking at China's economy, thinking about China's mode of production and what it's doing and the state-owned enterprises and so many things and the contradictions of its history. However, I think that China plays a leading role now in promoting peace and development and is opposed to the belligerence of the West. And so in that way, I say at this point, it's progressive. Just like we can say that the revolution in 1776 was progressive. Was it the ideal revolution? No. Was the Civil War ideal? No. As a US history teacher, I tell my students, I say, you can look back in history and find progressive elements. And so I think at this point, we will look back and say, these various countries played a progressive role in the transformation of the world system, in ultimately alleviating the suffering of people who had lived under a more tyrannical system, a more oppressive system. And so when we think about the international communist movement, I think that that's the real perspective we are pursuing. We are pursuing an idea that, okay, it's not perfect, but the anti-imperialist movement and countries of varying persuasions, for example, it is difficult for some communist parties, and I think that many of you can understand why, to say Iran is a progressive force, right, at this point. Because there are many comrades who would say, no, it's a theocratic, it's oppressive, and women, and so on and so forth. Yes, we can have our criticisms. Of course, we can have our criticisms. I'm not denying that we can have criticisms. But what I'm saying is that at this point, and I had the opportunity to meet with Hamas leaders in Qatar in August, where I got to interview them. At this point, they said that without Iran, where would we be? We would be nowhere. There would be no resistance. The US would dominate the region, and Israel would spread its wings. But with Iran's help, so I said, okay, maybe Iran's help is progressive in this sense. Well, maybe we can have that kind of analysis. But ultimately, it requires, I think, a humility that the ideology is not something static. It's not a religious dogmatism. It's a science. And therefore, science is changing with new inputs. and we all constantly have new things to interpret, right? The work's not done. The work is an everyday work. Our science is not like a physicist that finds an equation and we're done. Our science is that every day new inputs, new variables, new equations need to be created. And so in that sense, I think that we need to be dynamic. We need to be firm to principles, but we need to be dynamic in our application of the science. And so in that way, I think that at this point, the communist movement needs to see where the fault lines are in terms of the world system, where the people are yearning for their freedom, and support those people. And after we can achieve some tangible things, then we can have other debates about political economy and things like that.
Okay, next is Lucy, followed by Raj. And I just want to encourage some of the newcomers to this forum to raise your hand and ask questions. Don't be shy. This is not reserved for anybody in particular. We have a really interesting and important topic going on here, and raise your hand and ask your questions. So Lucy, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much, Christopher. I enjoyed your talk. It's very, very informative. The thing about what is dividing these communist groups, could the US have a role in that? Are they somehow underneath the ground, so to speak, putting divisions and questions? Because you see a lot of conflict between countries like China with India, China with Vietnam, and you keep wondering, where do they come out from? Why is that? Because the US is using a lot of power. They have the power of the dollar, that they can squeeze your neck if you're a country, right? And you're forced to do whatever they want you to do. So a lot of that, but in the communist movement, I'm wondering if some of that may be nationalism, or I don't know. I'm not sure, but I thought the response you gave just now has answered a lot of the question I had, because I agree that the primary contradiction is against imperialism at the point, and it should be the focus.
Thank you very much for your question, and I think it's a very good one, because it connects intimately with what we are talking about. I absolutely think that the U.S. Uses tools, diplomacy, and other means to create divisions within between countries that would otherwise be allies in the struggle. And of course, we can look back to history. Everybody here, I think, for the most part, was around in the dissolution of Yugoslavia. What did the other European powers do? What did the US do? They fomented sectarian division. They fomented division between Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and Catholics. What did the imperialist powers do in Lebanon that created the situation we have today? They divided Druze, Alawites, Maronite Christians, Orthodox Christians, Shia and Sunni against each other. So when France went to Lebanon, they said, we support the Catholics. When the Greeks were there, they said, we are Orthodox. When other powers came, we support Sunnis, or we support Shia. And therefore, they created an uneven situation within the country and then with their neighbors. Because now you had this fomenting of sectarianism, where you had no unifying identity, and those who tried to unify were seen as almost utopian. Oh, they want an identity, but first of all, we are this. And even now, for example, when I visit Lebanon, some of my friends say, we never ask our neighbors what religion they are, because we know that this is a tool of the imperialists. They want us to ask, well, what's your identity and things like that, so we can clash with each other. We are Lebanese, or we are Arabs, something to this effect, But I think it's a really pivotal point. I think that in addition to that, as I mentioned in a speech to the platform, I think that the United States uses various tools, which it claims, of course, the United States likes to hurl insults at China and say, Oh, they want to bring all these young people to give them propaganda. But the United States has the Fulbright program. The United States has various NGOs that work abroad. The United States funds universities and professors who support various aspects of the liberal order, and of course, that speak about human rights only from the vantage point of the US, that speak about various aspects of political theory or legal theory only from the vantage point of the West. And so therefore, you create an elite within these countries that are beholden to the US, that see the US as somehow the giver of everything that is good, democratic, that is rights-based, as if somehow they can't do it themselves, right? This is part of this is the extension of American exceptionalism, right? The fact that they see America as somehow exceptional. This is where liberty, hung her cap. This is the abode of rights. But of course, that's not true. Yes, it's true in a sense that the Constitution and we created a republic, we fought the British, but we had slavery here still too, Women couldn't even vote, right? It wasn't fully, it was progressive, but not progressive enough, right? And so I think that ultimately when we look at the US and how it functions, all of its institutions and structures are meant to perpetuate its power. And so whether that can be dividing people along religion, political factionalism, ethnicity, language, whatever it can do, it will try to stoke that. And we know that for sure. For example, today, the United States and the European Union are trying very hard, not only in Ukraine. We didn't even mention Georgia. We remember that Georgia and Russia fought a war, right? Just in the 2000s, right? 2008, right? And so, of course, the United States tries as hard as it can to pull the Georgian intelligentsia away from the Russian sphere, which they have been around since centuries, and to say somehow, no, you are somehow unique. You are also a European power, and you should join with the European Union and NATO. And so when I went and visited Georgia this summer, you could see tremendous contradictions within the society. A country that was part of the Soviet Union, part of the Russian Empire, and that now has tremendous conflicts within the society of who are they? Are Georgians European? Are they people who are closely aligned with Russia? But in actuality, they are a mixed people of the region. But they have historical ties geographically, religiously with Russia. And so it just shows that however they can pull them using the language of rights and liberties, and somehow Russia is authoritarian and you have to separate yourself and the propaganda and oh my gosh, they're going to try however they can. And so I think that certainly without doubt, the United States and other partners, including the European Union, do these things as well. They have made tremendous divisions within the Balkans as well. And since my mom is from Greece and I'm a Greek citizen, I have seen it on the ground in North Macedonia, in places in Serbia and its periphery, right? Where the European Union tries to get involved and tries to foment discord and historical revisionism, right? This is pivotal in Eastern Europe because this is one of the biggest aspects of the complaint by Russia, is that these American-funded and Western-funded institutions and professors who profess the same things out of Washington and Brussels, what do they say? Communism was the same as Nazism.
Yeah.
Right. This idea of the two totalitarianisms, right? And now we have a lot of so-called scholarship on this. And what do? They say, not only do we need to ban Nazi imagery, we need to ban communist imagery. And all those statues to the Great Patriotic War, we need to take them down. So all the partisans, not only Soviet partisans, partisans from the regional countries, Jewish partisans, they take everything down. They say, no, this is from another brutal fascistic ideology, totalitarian, authoritarian ideology. It needs to be removed. We only support the liberal order that we have now. And so that type of historical revisionism and that negation of the history that we all know very well. My grandparents fought in the Greek resistance during World War II with the Communist Party. And so, of course, could I imagine growing up without any of that history? without no knowledge of what these national liberation fronts did, what these partisans did. But a lot of young people are growing up with a different textbook because the European Union that funds a lot of these things and that helps to write curriculum has transformed how they see their own history and the history of the progressive movements of those countries. So I think that it's a very important thing to discuss. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's actually fact. We know it. We can document it. It's well established. The European Union and the European Council have had debates on it. And even communist parties in Europe have gone against them, who are members of the European Parliament, to say, how can you do this type of revisionism? It was the communists that saved Europe. But instead, nope, it wasn't. And we don't need to talk about them anymore because they are as bad as Nazis.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Raj, followed by Michael, followed by Norma. So Raj, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Very good, clear talk from you. Helps us all. I want to quote something from Lenin's essay, which is the same topic on which you're speaking. You said imperialism and split in socialism. I think it's written around 1916. I'll just quote you from there, a short quote. Lenin says, it is clear why imperialism is moribund capitalism. Moribund means lost its dynamic. Capitalism in transition to socialism. Monopoly, which grows out of capitalism, is already dying capitalism, the beginning of its transition to socialism. The tremendous socialization of labor by imperialism produces the same result. So, according to Lenin, the stage of imperialism is the dying stage of capitalism. So, I think that's what G7 represents, the dying stage of capitalism. And when they are dying in capitalism, they try to control the world through military and other strangleholds, financial oligarchic things. And set against it is BRICS led by China. China is the other rising pole of power, howsoever you define it. But it is very different in nature than the Western pole of power, which is murderous. There's a whole history. China doesn't have that history. And so when it emerges on top, what it would be like, we don't know. So the multipolarity is an intermediate stage because material dialectics teaches you can't have multipolarity until you reach communism. Then it's possible. So it's an intermediate stage, transitional stage, and I agree with you. That's what you're saying. So my thing is, I think rather than dismiss Lenin, saying, well, we shouldn't be focusing on his 5 criteria, I think the 5 criteria are important, but how to apply it is the question. So, so my question to you is how can you make a comment on your understanding about why we are, if we are, in the dying stage of capitalism, and what are the implications? Thank you.
Of course, thank you very much. I agree with you. I do believe that we're in the dying stages of capitalism, no doubt. I think that, and of course, I know that many people have made for the past, even if it's very interesting to look back as a historian, to look back at 30, 40 years of communist publications to say, it mirrors almost Fukuyama in a bizarre way. Like it's also like capitalism is ending. We're at the terminal crisis. This is the end. This is the year. And of course, I agree, but it's a longer term project. It's a longer term process. It's not going to happen overnight. It takes time. It takes time. Just like empires collapse over time, and it takes time to disintegrate and to change their networks and how they function. Capitalism is also changing and disintegrating. It has, first of all, there are issues in accumulation. There are issues in financialization. We have seen tremendous issues overall in terms of the stability of markets. There's questions over currency, the new emergence of alternative currencies. The emergence of these crypto markets and things. Derivatives have played a very negative role, and you've seen that the markets can only grow through the betting on future losses. They've turned the market from something with, say, for example, capital goods, steel, iron, ore, whatever it is, and you can build things with it and you can structure things with it, and you know how many blocks you're building, to let's gamble on whether this insurance company is going to go down and how many of their assets are AAA, AA, triple B, whatever it is. And let's bet on where they're going, and then we're going to make money off of that. I mean, that's not producing anything ultimately. That's totally ethereal. It's not within the realm of anything that we can have tangibly. And so I think that in this instance, we are at a point where the market can't hold any longer these various instruments. And actually, I think that we are on the verge of something akin to 2008 again. I think that there's a lot of instability within the market. I think that, okay, yes, everybody can congratulate themselves in Washington for what they called the slow landing, right? This is, okay, we had a rough landing for the economy. We didn't have so much, we didn't go into recession after this inflationary period. However, I think that there are other people saying that's a very short-term look at it. The long-term analysis is that we are headed for a terminal crisis. At least it could be a periodic one, but it's going to be a very severe one. And I think that all of these, we are seeing a more rapid development of these crises, especially I can speak of the United States, because after the 2008 financial crisis and the reversal of New Deal economic policies that tried to limit the investment of consumer finances into the market, into financial instruments, now, of course, we have a situation where those regulations are still not in place. And so consumer deposits are being used in financial markets, and we have a lot of banks. We had actually a few banks fail just in the past 2 years, right? In the Pacific. I think it was it Seattle, in Washington or Oregon, where Pacific banks collapsed, or Silicon Valley. Some of these banks completely collapsed. They had debt leveraged way over their heads. So I think we are headed for that as well. I think that in the opposite side, because we can think of, for example, the US market, but we know that markets are interconnected, right? I think that on the other side, when you think of China, China's economy certainly has some of these aspects in terms of, okay, yes, there's real estate, there's some level of speculation, but it is a lot more constricted, right? First and foremost, China's economy is still majority state-owned in terms of various metrics that you can look at. And certainly there has been a liberalization of other aspects of the economy, but because the party has a level of control through its main banks in terms of really reining in the excesses of the market, they're able to control many of these things. And of course, the economists and Financial Times like to tell us every year, oh, China's going down, that's it, end of the Chinese experiment. But we haven't seen anything like that in China. China continues to have an economic policy that is in some way constructive and safeguarding the assets of the people in a way that the United States doesn't do that. Even though they could, they have the power, they have the legislative authority to rein in a lot of these financial institutions, they won't do it. They won't do it because they're bought off by them anyway. So I think that here we are certainly entering into a crisis in the West, no doubt about it. And I think many of us, especially for those of you on the West Coast, I just was visiting California. There's a lot of homelessness. A lot of homelessness around now. There's a big crisis in housing. There's a big crisis in terms of aspects of the use of real estate and speculation that have led to, for example, not only in some places a lack of housing. I live in Vermont. So in Vermont, we are 30 years behind in terms of housing. We would need to spend 30 years to build housing just to get to the housing needs of today. So of course, how are we going to do this, right? But in other places, there has been real estate monopolies that with speculation and with the purchasing of these properties that have led to gentrification, pushing people out, and then not providing them with any opportunities. They can't own the homes, they can't be housed, they can't even have decent paying jobs. We're still fighting. We still don't even have Fight for 15. We've been fighting for it for how many years? 20 years. We're not even at 15. How can we get to 25 or 30 where the economy is supposed to be now in terms of wages? So I think that definitely we are headed into crisis. I think that BRICS represent, even with the disagreements between, for example, India, China, yes, of course, there are territorial disputes, there are other long-standing disputes, but I think the Chinese and the Indians are pragmatic. They say, okay, look, we have our problems, okay, but where can we cooperate? And I think that BRICS is a pragmatic organization, even more pragmatic than the Americans, even though the Americans claim to be the most pragmatic. They're the developers of pragmatism. They say, look, we are not all the same in terms of our political systems, in terms of some domestic issues, but we believe that we can create a more stable and effective and holistic world economy that is ultimately centered on human needs versus on these financial needs, the profit motive for the big corporations and banks and monopolies. So I think in that way, there's going to be a crisis, but my hope is that the counterbalance will help to alleviate that suffering. And I think that the sanctions on Russia are indicative of the failure of the United States to completely collapse another economy now. I think that this 2 years has shown everyone that the United States' power in terms of economy is far less than it has been in the past. Where the United States maybe 20 years ago could have brought down a country's economy, now it's much more difficult because the global economic system is experiencing a transformation where now these countries can do trading in their own currencies. They can do trading in unique ways that is outside of the control of the United States and the West. And I think that's where we are seeing that the West is declining in this way, because even their power just in front of us is less than it has been in the past. And in that way, I think that the contradictions of especially the imperialist system are going to be hardest felt here, because this is the source, at least of finance capital. Even the world systems analysts would say that, Arigi, I think of, and Wallerstein and others. This is the source here. So I think that this is where we are going to see this multipolarity emerge even more acutely, is through these economic transformations that are to come in the next decades.
So I have a quick follow-up question.
Sure, please.
Okay, so the quick question is, Lenin identified the split in socialism in 1916 because of bribing of a layer of working class in the imperialist countries. But today the split is on something else. Could you comment on that? It's not on the bribe layer. It's not, the basis is not the bribe layer, or is it? Why is the split now? Whereas Lenin identified in 16. What is it today, in your opinion?
I think this is a complex question for me, because I have a few ideas. I'm not sure. This would be theoretical for me. I think first of all, I think that the split is most acute in the West. And the split is most acute in the West for a variety of domestic factors. It's not necessarily the bribery, because ultimately working class wages are stagnating or declining. Working class living conditions are stagnating and declining. And even some people are wondering, was there ever really a large working class to begin with, or middle class to begin with, in terms of the good quality of life? Because it really bumped a generation and then went down. So I think that in this sense, for example, why do we see some of the working class in these countries not aligned fully? I think, for example, if we were to look at the various chauvinisms on one side, for example, the Russophobia and xenophobia in the US and in other Western countries has been amplified to a level where your country is better off with us because we are like you. These other countries are going to come and they're going to destroy everything that you have, right? They're going to eat everything. And so, for example, in Italy, in Greece, and in other places, especially in the US, the anti-China sentiment is unbelievable. And people, even ordinary people that I'd never think are political at all, tell me, oh, China is going to destroy us. And I said, how did you come to this conclusion? Right? Oh, we heard about it. Oh, somebody talked about it. We saw something on the social media about it, right? So we see a vast campaign against some of these countries. And we see, for example, I was at a hotel recently. The Epoch Times was the newspaper there. I mean, I would have been more happy with the New York Times or the Washington Post versus the Epoch Times, but it was there. And of course, we know it's a paper from Falun Gong, and it's funded by the enemies of China to create and to foment this anti-China sentiment. So that's one aspect. I definitely think that there's a chauvinism, there's a level of aggression towards these other countries and these other movements. On the second one, I think on the other side, if we were to divide this, I think that there's also a level of liberalism that has led many of these movements to say, oh, these other countries are conservative, patriarchal, they don't support identity issues, they are not supportive of LGBTQ, and therefore we cannot support them. In fact, we must be against them. And of course, for me, I can't fathom this because I said, well, maybe if they had good quality of life, they could talk about these things like philosophers in the forum or in the agora. But they don't have a chance. They're trying to survive. They're trying to make it to the next day in this system that we have today, under this barbarism. So it's the same criticism that they have, for example, in Palestine with the pinkwashing. Oh, Hamas is going to kill all the gays. Israel doesn't, therefore we should support Israel. I said, but wait a minute. It's not only about this issue. It's a lot more than that. And I don't hear about all these killings you're speaking about, right? But this hyperbolic language on both sides of this equation leads to, I think, a labor movement, a working class within these, especially Western countries, that are antagonistic for different reasons towards other countries. And I think the importance is to focus on really base issues. They are workers. They're also suffering. Look at what we are doing over there, the focus on wars, the focus on imperial overreach, these kinds of things, as opposed to identity considerations from one side or a sort of chauvinism or nationalism on the other side. That's where I would say a lot of the disagreement comes. I think, for example, the disagreement between Greece and China related to, even in the Solidnet, is related directly to the fact that China controls the port and that the Communist Party runs the union on the port, and they're not happy that one communist country controls the port and the other communist country is running the union at the port. And so there are national considerations then, because instead of trying to figure out how can we work together, how can we figure out how we can cooperate, it's antagonism. No, the Greek port belongs to Greece. China shouldn't have anything to do here, right? And so I think that that's a small scale example of what we are seeing throughout many of these countries. I think it's a deep concern, and I think that that's why we see segments of the labor movement supportive now on Palestine, but a lot of other segments of the labor union not supportive. For example, I'm in the NEA. I'm in the teachers union. I'm on the executive board of the NEA in New Hampshire. When we went to our national convention just now, this past summer, of course, there were like 15 resolutions about what's happening in Gaza. And of course, many people got up and spoke and said, this is not a union issue. This is not the purview of the union. This is not a labor issue. We are people in America. Why do we care about what's going on over there? And of course, I got up and others got up and said, well, first of all, there are teachers there. They are struggling. They are under apartheid. They are oppressed. We keep talking about rights and human rights in our classrooms. We talk about Black Lives Matter in our classroom, and we're not going to support other people. What, only the rights are within our border? We don't have any concerns for anybody else's rights? Or maybe only when it's convenient. When the rights are, oh, these people are oppressed there. That's what the government's saying. Let's all rally behind the government, right? So I think that it shows me various examples in practical terms of what we are experiencing as a nation and as a labor movement now. Because I know, I'm sure many people on this call have been in unions or been involved in the labor movement. And so we are seeing it. It's not foreign to us. We are seeing the ongoing contradictions here. So I think that that's part of the divisions. I'm sure there are more things to consider, but I think that some of those things are being exploited to divide workers and to divide movements around the world.
Okay, next is Michael, followed by Norma. So Michael, if you would unmute and ask your question.
Yes.
Oh, by the way, go ahead.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, this is Michael McKinley in Des Moines, Iowa. And first word is duh. Des Moines. Anyway, I see that Richard, I think, left. Is not here, I guess. No. Anyway, I wanted to. My comment is more of a comment and a request for elaboration. I want to applaud the emphasis on the American Communist Party for emphasizing unity and the idea of unity. And the way I see the split that happened that developed the American Communist Party, it seems like it's kind of an opposition in a way, but it is a split, but from the Communist Party USA. But I see it more as that is a central problem of the organization of communist parties and communist organizations all through the nation, all through this nation and the world, is this idea of every time there's a small difference, every time there's a small limited kind of difference, we're going to split into a different organization and we're going to fight and oppose each other the public is going to be absolutely confused as to what communism is, and it fosters confusion. It plays into the whole essence of Western Marxism and what the CIA and the national security state in this country have done, and the State Department have done in developing all these developing Western Marxism out of the National Endowment for Democracy and other kinds of things. Anyway, I just wanted to applaud you and say I wish to see more emphasis. I wish to see more emphasis upon what brings these organizations, these different communist organizations, what unites them, what is the similarities, what are where do they agree, and pull it together into an organization that everyone can participate in. We really have gotten. I mean, the communist movement, I think, has gotten way too much splintered into small differences of history and personal prerogative and personal relationships. And anyway, that's my comment on it. And I wanted to just see how you respond to that.
I think you are correct, and I think that ultimately one of the aspects of the communist movement in the West, especially in the United States, is the rampant individualism that exists, the inability to be in a collective that really emphasizes the fact that we disagree. For example, all of us have families to a greater or lesser extent, some bigger, some smaller, people that we love in our lives, friends. We don't agree with them on everything. I mean, even, for example, color choices for painting the wall. I disagree with my wife. Does that mean that's it? I'm getting divorced. Finish. End of story. Of course not. I certainly think that there are some things that are red lines, we could say. But I think on the question of unity, as long as we are united around important principles, I think that minor variations will exist anyway and should be allowed to flourish. And debate should be not only allowed, but encouraged to create some diverse perspectives, to have some robust exchange within the party and within the organization. I think that has been very difficult for many organizations in the US to do and in the West. I think it has been the case, in my experience, that if you go outside of the bounds, you are outside the organization, exiled. That's it, finished. And we cut off ties. And I think that that's actually a nice thing about this group. I'm sure not all of you agree on a lot of issues, maybe minor issues, but you all come together. I think that we need to do that. We do that as a society anyway. Humanity does that. So we need to find a way to have some sort of universal overarching principles we can agree on and allow for the particularities under that universal sort of overarching criteria to allow that to exist, allow it to really really flourish. And so I think that ultimately for our party has brought together comrades from CPUSA, PCUSA, from Midwestern Marx, from infrared community, people from outside the official sort of communist organizations, even some from PSL and workers' world historically, that have come to us and said, look, we appreciate the various principles, especially anti-imperialism, that you focus on. And we appreciate also the perspective on the United States, looking at the history, also not only for the evils, of course, we can agree, the genocide of the indigenous people, slavery, settler colonialism, etc., but also the progressive aspects of the country. And we can look and say, look, it hasn't only been bad. There have been some good things. There has been an entire movement here. There has been a civil war for rights. There has been 100 years of CPUSA and other organizations and comrades fighting, the labor movement, the movement for civil rights, the movement for equality. So we look at that and we say that should also be encouraged. That should also be stressed. And for example, I had a meeting with the communists in France, and I said, comrades, which flag do you fly? And they say, we fly two flags, the red banner and the tricolor, because both for us are our heritage. We are communists, we are internationalists, but we also have a nation with its history and its perspectives and its traditions. And so in that way, I think that we can also say that for this country as well. The American flag means different things for different people, but ultimately, as it is, and we could change it, whatever, I don't mind, but we have a flag as a nation, and we have the flag of internationalism. And until we can have a situation where maybe one day in the future, who knows when we're, spacefaring civilization, who knows, when we can all live together under one, until that point, the material reality is we live in nations. And so I think that part of the issues that we have been confronted with is some parts of our movement antagonistic completely to the United States, and I can say justifiably in many ways. But ultimately, if our question is about appealing to the broad masses, most Americans are, to a greater or lesser extent, happy to be here, proud to be here. They live their lives here. They know nothing else different than here. And so, when we think about unity and we think about these divisions on something like that, that has created tremendous division. And I don't think it should. I think that we can do two things at once. We can talk about the crimes, we can be against US imperialism, and at the same time, we can advocate for a new society here, a more just society here. And that's what I would say, and that's what our party emphasizes ultimately. And I think that that's why we've had the reception we've had so far, is that we are not so extreme on one side or the other. I think you have to have a sort of middle path here, sort of thread the needle on this question. And I think that has been a good thing overall.
Okay, so we actually have 5 people have their hands up. We want to try to get all of our questions, and I'm going to ask everybody to limit your questions to one question. And Chris, you might want to pay attention to the clock as far as time. We're definitely going to end this on time. There might be other people who have questions too. So next up is Norma, followed by Jean, followed by Peter. So go ahead, Norma, please go ahead.
Greetings, Christopher. Yay. I don't know if you've been watching my support finger going. Ken Burns did a program on the buffalo, And one of the things he said in it is that the people drove the buffalo off the land and the land became non-wild. And he explained that as a bad thing. I see it, the next line is, yeah, now the land is available to be used to grow soybeans and crap and food to feed the people who are escaping persecution throughout the world and drowning. And they're coming here and they're being fed off of these fields that have been made available to create the terrible food that is given to them to sustain themselves in their labor for our owning class. So that, and the thing is that the people that do the work of moving the buffalo off the land, why did they have to do that? It is in service to the owning class. It is not in service to those people, and the people don't understand it. And then the people go to work for some way to make some money, which is held by the owning class. And the people don't see their enslavement to our owners. We white, I'm white-ish. We white people have been in a slave relationship, begging for jobs. There's not enough jobs. They certainly don't pay well. There's certainly oppressive circumstances. We're begging for jobs like any other enslaved arrangement. Please don't beat me. Please don't rape me and my children. We're stuck with an enslavement that we don't recognize. We think we're free here, and we're not. We're the opposite. We're in that slave relationship. Alongside of that comment that I expect you will enjoy,
That's two and a half, so go ahead and wrap it up.
Is that China is the adverse relationship to China has been created by Biden. He said it when he walked away from some speeching and made some over-the-shoulder comment about China, including the potential for them bombing us. That's been a couple of years now, and nothing was going on about that until he did that.
So
as far as
it's actually over 3 minutes now, so why don't we let Chris respond? Okay, go ahead, Chris.
I want to thank Norma, and thank you for all the thumbs up. I appreciate it throughout the presentation.
I'm gonna have to send you the chat because you haven't had a chance to read it, I don't think. And so I need your email posted.
Sure, we can put that in the chat. No problem at all. Actually, I'll put that in now so I don't forget to everybody. Feel free to email me anytime.
And let's try to keep each one to about 5 minutes total. Okay, because now we have 5 people again who have their hands up. So
no problem.
Yeah.
No problem.
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out the question you want me to answer. If you could summarize it in a sentence or two.
Well, it's whether or not people can come to recognize overall that we are enslaved. That this relationship is a slave relationship. Our owners let us maintain ourselves in their service, which, as Marx has told us, provides the profiteering that goes on for the owner's benefit. And I always capitalize owners when I write it down.
I think that people can understand that slavery. I think that it's easier to understand the harder your conditions are. And I think that that goes back to the classic situation with the development of a labor aristocracy and the rationale for the creation of a middle class to stem the tide of a working class movement that would overthrow the capitalists altogether.
the 8-hour day is a brutality rendered upon us.
I agree. And actually, as I tell my students, I say that the clock, the development of the clock, the development of our rhythms of life, which used to be seasonal and now are to the minute, to the second, was done by the capitalist class. The logic was a managerial system that would control every aspect, where we had to regiment ourselves, not by the cycles of the sun and the moon,
Right.
but
Let me tell you another thing. Opportunity. Opportunity is
Actually,
us,
we need to move on to next
Yeah,
question. We've got
is
5
us-
people on. So,
right. Opportunity is us racing to compete with each other for the ability to provide for ourselves. That's so capitalist. I want cooperation.
okay, next up is Jean, followed by Peter. So Jean, and let's try to keep the questions to 2 minutes because we want to get everybody in.
Okay, Chris, thanks so much for your talk. I mean, this has personally given me so much to think about and a lot to digest over the next few days and weeks and so on. So I really appreciate everything you brought up here. And I'm wearing my Veterans for Peace hat, as I always do today. And as you may or may not know, Veterans for Peace is a educational and humanitarian organization dedicated to the abolishment of war. And people may say, well, why don't you try to abolish earthquakes or something, because you're not going to be able to abolish war. And of course, we disagree. It is possible to abolish war, and we need to work that way. And particularly, we need to focus on the wars that our own country has been waging. So that's one background of where I'm coming from and my organization is. But we recently came out with a statement, our national organization did, supporting Roe versus Wade, basically saying women have an inalienable right to control their bodies. And a nation that controls the rights of women, what else are they going to do? If they do that at home, what are they going to do abroad? What kind? Because people have said women don't make war, men make war, and we need to recognize this fact. And I think the recognition of the right of women to control their own bodies, embodied in Roe versus Wade, again, has international complications. And just one quick thing, Joe Biden was down at the ceremony to make the Stonewall Inn in Lower Manhattan a national monument. And he spoke there, supporting this, which he didn't have to do, but he did come out very strongly in favor of gay rights and saying that this is going to be part of our foreign policy. So I think these are important issues. I just wonder what your position on that is. And again, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you so much. I'm a member of the Will Miller chapter of Veterans for Peace. I myself am a former U.S. Army officer, and I did not go to Afghanistan when I was ordered to, and I left the military. I resigned as a result. So I am intimately aware of the crimes of our government and also the great work of Veterans for Peace and other organizations for conscientious objectors and for those who are against war. I think that in this situation, I always find it interesting because I have my students, sometimes they say, well, Mr. Helali, women also, they should be leaders. They won't fight. They are peaceful. And of course, I put up a picture of Catherine the Great, Nefertiti, and Margaret Thatcher. And I say, well, we could have these leaders too. Not so much different, than some of the men in the same time period. So I do think that certainly the fight for rights is important. I think that when the rights in this country, when our struggles, our domestic struggles, are internationalized, I think they are done so not in a progressive and somehow what's the word I'm looking for? They're not done in a charitable way to help other countries. They are done to control other countries. They're done to hit the hammer on other countries. And ultimately, for example, when we say, and we are well aware of this, when we say this country is committing human rights violations, this country has passed these laws, it's always done with the doublespeak that somehow that invites aggression. That invites our aggression because we are the protectors of these people. We are the promoters of these rights, even though many people don't have them here, right? We can talk about women's rights all we want in other places, and we can go to war over them. And of course, on this instance, I always have to bring up, because people in the liberal establishment will always say, oh, these kids supporting Palestinians who oppress women, who put the headscarf on. And of course, I have to say, but when the Soviet Union was defending socialist Afghanistan, that didn't have any headscarves for women and allowed women to get PhDs in physics, you had no problem supporting Mujahideen and the people who eventually became the Taliban, right? And so I always think that we have to operate in a way that tries to dismantle many of the myths that help to lead toward war, many of the myths that are used to manipulate the public's perception and the public's ultimate support for some of these conflicts. And I think that we always have to be very sober in our analysis on how we get into the wars in the first place. And so I have no issue, for example, with Veterans for Peace speaking about these issues domestically. I think we all do, to a greater or lesser extent in our communities and things. But ultimately, the United States has a strong historical record and a continued tendency to use these various single issues, or especially social issues, to help launch efforts to support war. And it's very clear from the media, especially the commentators and the talking heads and the comedians, what the ultimate aims are in terms of using these various aspects to shape public opinion against people out there, ultimately in the lead up to conflict. And I think we have to be very careful. We should be on guard with it, in my opinion.
Okay, next is
Thank you.
Peter, followed by Janet. Please unmute, Peter.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you raised some, Chris, thanks for this talk, very interesting, and raised some really, really important questions. One of which is what worldview should a communist have? And I enjoyed listening to your description of the decline of capitalism, the kind of transforming of the imperialist world, unipolar world into multipolar world, etc. Yet I still wonder about you mentioned earlier, that many leftists have repeatedly over the decades said that capitalism's coming to an end and it's declining, and you continue you agree that capitalism is declining, and your reasoning is well, the imperialist powers are losing their grip, and China is rising, and there's financialization, there's all these financial structures are no longer producing anything. To me, this is really a not accurate reading of what's going on in the world. To me, financialization, credit default swaps, all these other financial instruments are not an indication of decline of capitalism whatsoever. I mean, I have seen the decline of capitalism. Yes, it does decline in various ways and grows in various ways. I worked in a factory making airplane parts for many years in industrial proletariat, and saw the tremendous industrial productivity of American working class. And it was mind-boggling at that in the 70s of what was being produced, and compared to now, where all we see are empty factories and wastelands of what used to be the industrial production of the West is that no longer exists. So if anyone thinks should think has a right to believe that capitalism is ending, it would be me, but I do not. All the multipolar world that people point to as the end of capitalism is in fact capitalism. The third world is capitalist. This is because they are not imperialist does not mean they are not capitalist. And capitalism will not decline of its own inertia, of its own crises. It is impossible to predict a decline in capitalism based on rise and fall of various blocks. So I take a different view of capitalism, that there has to be an effective growing socialist movement and revolutionary movements to overthrow capital. I don't believe capitalism declines on its own. I certainly don't see any signs of that. And all you have to do is look across all the wars that America is forcing on the world. So anyway, that's just my take on it. Maybe I misread some of your words, perhaps meant something a little bit differently. But I'm just wondering how you respond to people that don't see a particular decline in capitalism that's very obvious.
I think that's a common perspective amongst many people that I engage with. There are those, for example, that share your view, Peter. There are others, for example, and I think of my friend Yanis Varoufakis, who says, for example, that we are actually going backwards. We're going to sort of a feudalism. There's a transformation that's happening, and we're actually going backwards in terms of mode of production. And then, of course, as a student of world systems theory, when I studied in the academy, I think of, for example, the work of Giovanni Arrighi and many others who said, for example, in the long history of capitalism, capitalism has always developed in terms of financial centers to greater territorial areas and markets. So, for example, if we were to start capitalism's development with Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and others, Florence, we transition to the Dutch in the Netherlands. We move from the Netherlands to the United Kingdom, and then eventually move from the United Kingdom to the United States. Then the question next is, where does it go after that? So if financial markets, if the financial center of the world is the United States, if the United States is the financial floor of the world and China is the factory floor of the world, what is the next step? What is the next step? Where does capitalism go from there? How does capitalism advance from there? And of course, you might be interested in Ming-Chi Lee, a Chinese economist in the University of Utah, who wrote a great book that talked about the rise of China and the collapse of the capitalist world economy. And his idea was twofold. Either the capitalist economies will collapse with a move to China and a socialist economic system, or we are going to move towards the most brutal capitalisms afterwards, because there's going to be a fragmentation, and that will ultimately lead towards even further intensification of conflicts. So I wish I had a crystal ball or a Palantir or something to see the future, something to kind of gauge where we're going. I would say that in the United States, I think we are headed for crisis, and I think that crisis will lead to further social instability. Whether that leads to a transformation, I don't know. Whether anything is guaranteed, I have said it repeatedly. I do not think socialism is guaranteed at all. And I don't think that in a nuclear age, we can say that there's a guarantee, because there are so many variables that can change the equation. I do think, however, that we are entering a period of volatility and a period where alternatives are more likely than not to emerge. And I think that your statement, if I would read it accurately, you might not think that some of these other blocs might have socialist elements within them, or countries that are socialist. If that's the case, then the question would be, of course, the classic one, whether capitalism can have a human face. And I think all of us would agree that we don't think so. that there's no possibility of that happening. So then ultimately it's left to various movements within the countries and the overall international working class to take advantage of the situation. But we've seen historically that it's uneven. It's not possible to do on a global scale. As no matter how many people say we need a general strike, we need all the workers to rise up together, because of the fact that we have the nation state that exists, and nation states are different, and different people are at different places in terms of their development, their quality of life, the various indices we can use for their existence. Some places will rise up and other people will stay quiet.
Yeah, I'm not a Trotskyist.
No, totally. I totally understand. So I'm just saying, I don't know. I think that certainly I think that capitalism can't last forever. So in that way, it might be a very long decline, but it's going to end at some point. I don't know where we're going to go after that, though. I'm not, my hope is that multipolarity will allow a space for something new to emerge, but I don't think it's a guarantee that anything good is guaranteed to come. I don't think that. I think that there are possibilities. So we have a little bit more possibilities. Maybe the equation goes from 10% possible to 30% possible, but it still might be low in terms of what's possible. But I still think that 20% is worth fighting for. I think anything is worth fighting for at this point. Anything that helps to improve our situation. But I try to remain always optimistic. This is also I think we always, I mean, I have kids. I have 3 kids. How can I not be optimistic? I would be doing a disservice as a father to say somehow I'm not going to fight for a better world for you. I can't guarantee it, but I will fight. And I think a lot of other people will fight for it. And I think that's where my ethos is. And I think ultimately, I think that's our historical mission. Whether we achieve it or not is, I think, secondary to the fact that we must continue to be active and to fight for a better world.
Okay, on November 3rd, I just want to say that we're going to have a full session talking about financial, economic instability, international economic challenges, really ties into this topic that's come up. Next is Janet, followed by Sharon. Again, I want to ask people to one question. Let's try to keep it limited. We've tried to get everybody in. Go ahead, Janet, please.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you, Christopher, for your presentation and for your work. I'd be interested in knowing what percentage of Russia's mode of production is privately controlled, same for China, and what type of goods are produced privately. Related to this, and to what Peter talked about, does a country have to be considered either capitalist or communist socialist? Isn't it possible to have something in between, a hybrid? Would you comment on this? And let me just add that I've posted a screenshot of a map recently displayed by Israel's finance minister. This is, I've posted it in the chat, which shows Greater Israel, including West Bank, Gaza, parts of Jordan, parts of Lebanon, parts of Saudi Arabia, and parts of Syria. To me, Zionism's Greater Israel project is a form of imperialism.
Janet, those are 3 questions already.
Which actually serves US imperialism. I'll stop there.
On the third point, I agree. And actually, we've seen it from Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and many others now in the parliament, especially the ultra-right, I would say, the fascists of Israel. Although now the question is who's really, maybe all the leadership is fascist at this point. But definitely there is this perspective by some of the Greater Israel project. And I agree with you. I think that Israel is a country that is sort of the aircraft carrier in the region, and its goal is ultimately expansion, and of course the promotion of US aims and Western aims in the region. I think on your first question, I don't have the statistics in front of me, I apologize. I think that that's something I can look up, and if you email me, we can correspond. I do have some papers and articles and chapters that I think would help you with that. I do know that, of course, Russia's economy is far more privatized than China's. China's still has state control, especially over banking, finances, and over enterprises that are of a national security or strategic importance for the Chinese economy. For example, production of steel, production of concrete, various elements, anything required in building, military, some technological components, and then overall infrastructure. Most of that is in the hands of the state. Other elements of the economy after opening up and reform under Deng Xiaoping have been liberalized to a greater or lesser extent, and then following along the path, Deng to Jiang Zemin and so on. I think that there's a possibility that China will try to control even more because of some of the instability caused by some of the private enterprises. We'll see. There might be, so there's some talk in some circles that China might go backwards and try to, well, backwards we would think is forwards. Will go and try to renationalize some key industries that they think would be important for them in the future. Also, for example, I forgot, Sinopec, right? The China's state-owned gas and petroleum industry is also nationalized. It's also a state-owned enterprise. So these elements of the Chinese economy are in the hands of the state, and so in the hands of the people. I certainly think that there's some level of hybridization here. That, of course, we can say, for example, there's capitalist countries, but within that definition, there are variations of what kind of capitalism or what level they are at, or how much rights are given, or to a greater or lesser extent, their relationship with the workers and managers and things like that. I think that in the same way, socialism has various aspects within it. I think it's a very fraught debate. I think questions of mode of production, whether they are concrete, whether there is some level of unevenness in how you make the jump from capitalist mode of production to socialist mode of production, and how that looks ultimately. I mean, I've read a lot of articles from different theoreticians, different academics, some of them my friends, who disagree with one another on what that looks like. And some who even wonder about modes of production in existing socialist states in the 20th century and what they look like, looking at economic data, looking at various indices. I think ultimately it requires more investigation. It requires us to understand and to have a common language about what we mean when we say these terms, because I think that there's disagreement on the left about what different people mean when they are used loosely. But I think that certainly, I think that there can be variation within states and within economies, and what they look like, how much government control. Is there a greater or lesser degree of intervention in the market? What does it look like in terms of the banking and finance sector? What does it look like in terms of labor rights? For example, in Germany, you have this process where workers work with management, and that's arbitrated by the, there's some sort of management by the state to ensure a level of performance and a smooth cooperation between that. We don't have anything like that in the US. The German system of labor relations, we don't have. Does that make it a little bit different in terms of a system? Possibly. It depends on what we would define as a difference. Or when people say Scandinavia is different. Well, yes, I mean, they have sovereign state funds. They use the money in a different way. The level of what the workers have is a little bit different depending on what we're asking, what we're talking about: education, healthcare, childcare. What are we looking at? So I think that in this way, we can probably develop some variations within our definitions to sort of create a greater sense of clarity as to what these countries look like.
Okay, Sharon, last question. Please unmute. Go ahead.
So I have a comment and a question. Historically speaking, the two great socialist revolutions that we know of both emerged from the the chaos and loss during in 2 world wars. And I believe that the US is planning a war against China. They're building up the bases all over Asia, especially in the Philippines. It's pretty much written out what they have planned. It's not hard to find. And the losses that the US working class is going to suffer in that war are unimaginable, or imaginable in very, very bad terms, including the possibility of nuclear exchange. So it seems to me that it as part and parcel of educating the American workers about US imperialism, it's really important to talk about the possibility of war and how we should oppose it. Many groups are doing that, but it's certainly has not been enough. As you point out, the anti-China sentiment and the anti-Russia sentiment has been exacerbated, built up enormously in the last period. And it's very hard to talk to people about how China is not our enemy. And so I wonder how you think about educating the masses of US workers around anti-imperialism and around the role of our government in all the bad things that happen all over the world.
I mean, I'd say thank you very much for your comment and question. I agree that certainly the 2 great revolutions you are referring to, out of the First World War, the Russian, out of the Second World War, the Chinese, both of them emerged, I would say, well, the first emerged in a non-nuclear age. The second emerged in a very new nuclear age. The third one, I don't believe is possible in the same way, given the fact that now we have over almost 8+ countries with nuclear weapons, right? I think that the dangers of war, I think that certainly there are some people who are maybe with the fantasies that war will lead to an opening and we're going to build socialism. I don't see that necessarily. I really don't. Not in a nuclear age. Maybe if we were a century ago, possibility, but not now. Not now. Not in an era where you can wipe out entire cities and populations with the push of a button.
I was not speaking in favor of nuclear war.
No, I agree with you. I'm saying that there are people who say that. There are people who advocate some sort of accelerationist position. I think everybody here, for the most, is against that and wants to stem the tide of the sort of the clock going to midnight, right? We're at 90 seconds, as I checked last from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So it's very dangerous. It's very, very dangerous. I think that American workers, I think the American people, to a greater or lesser extent, understand some of the existential dangers, but they don't understand how pressing of an issue it is, and they don't understand how close we are to the possibility of war breaking out. And so I think that in terms of my education and what I do, I really try to explain first and foremost that when we say Russia and China are not our enemies, they have no desire to take over the United States. There are no plans. They have enough issues in their own countries. They have said it repeatedly, and they have shown no aggression towards the US mainland at all. There's no evidence that anyone can bring that would say that they are antagonistic. And even when they were antagonistic, Khrushchev took the missiles out. So I always try to say that in the same way as when we were at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the darkest days of the Cold War, now, of course, we have the foresight, we have at least the history, and we have the foresight to say, well, we know that we can solve a lot of these issues that bring us to the brink. The question ultimately is, can we create a relationship where we don't have to always worry about being at the brink? Can we have a situation where people say, yes, we might have differences, but war is not the answer? And I think the only way to do that is to continue to create the opportunities for people to learn about these countries, to learn about their histories, to meet people, to do kinds of exchanges. I think a lot of these delegations have been very important, but I think ultimately it is to show that the US, more often than not, is the main belligerent around the world. I think now, in terms of Russia, there are segments of the US population that are recognizing that. But I think it's much less in terms of China. I think that we have a lot of work to do to educate the American people about China, its history, what it seeks to do in the world, how it functions, and how we can have a constructive relationship with China. I think that many more people have been critical of the war in Ukraine on the right, but I think that we need to be critical of all the wars. And I think the only way we can do that is ultimately, like I mentioned before, the idea of unity. I work with everybody who wants to work. I was just in New York at the event with Scott Ritter and many others who were talking out against the war drive and things like that. And it brought together large segments of the population in terms of disparate political views. I think as an American population, we need to bring people of all perspectives and sort of lay it out and let them know this is what we want to avoid, which is war. And in order to do that, we need to understand what our government's doing and what China and Russia, who they are and what they want, and to find some way at trying to mediate that. Other than that, there's no way that I can foresee us curbing and stemming the tide of all of the media and all of the propaganda that's coming to really convince the American people that these two countries are the greatest threats. And now I've heard that Kamala Harris said that Iran is also at the top of the list. So I think that all of these are very dangerous. They are very dangerous because I think that there are parts of the US war machine that are ready to strike, that want to escalate the situation. I think we have to be very careful about this, and we have to continually have our anti-war voices out at the forefront and saying peace, peace with Russia, peace with China, and that they're not our enemies. I think that's the only way that we can really do things. And I think we have to work and struggle in our unions, in our places of work, within our communities as best as possible to try to help people see that and understand that. Without that, I mean, it's clear that the American government, that as the different parts of the American establishment are interested in increasing the conflict and are preparing for war.
That's a great closing point. Chris, I want to thank you so much for coming and presenting. This was a very informative and engaging session. I want to thank everybody for your questions. I thought the Q&A was really very, very good. Come back next week. Grover Furr will be speaking on his latest book, and sign up at ICSSmarks.org for email notifications, and drop us a line, make a donation, contact us if you have anything to say. So thank you much. I'm sure your voice is, hopefully your voice will be with you the rest of the day, Chris, but really appreciate the time that you spent preparing and presenting.
Thank you all so much for your great questions and for listening to me. Please reach out, and I look forward to working with you all now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.